Is this a new pattern of protest that is emerging? To discuss that, we are joined now in studio by Professor Kwandiwe Kondlo, who's just conducted a study on service delivery protests. Professor, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you for joining us on PM News.
Thank you.
Now, Professor, there seems to be a new trend emerging with these protests in South Africa. They're getting more destructive and even more violent. What do you think explains this kind of behavior in your view?
Look, I don't think it's only this year that we see violence as part of service delivery protests. Even in 2008, 9, up to around August 2010, service delivery protests in South Africa have tended to assume a very violent posture. And this is worrying, and it is actually difficult to even say exactly why is there such violence accompanying service delivery protests. But one can actually venture and argue along the lines that the new dispensation in South Africa, as perceived by ordinary citizens, is characterized by an elusive hope. There's a lot of hope ordinary citizens have, but at the end of the day, nothing very substantive really happens. And frustrations are actually piling up, and at the same time, criminal elements from within these communities also participate in these protests. As you see the escalation of unreasonable violence. Yes, so I'm trying to say there is genuine frustration amongst communities. There are perceptions amongst communities that the new dispensation, even at local government level, has produced fat cats and has hardly delivered to the poorest of the poor. There are those perceptions. But at the same time, given the state, the condition of our communities, you do find certain criminal elements also participating in popular protests. When you're talking about criminal elements, you're talking about groups involved in some drug syndicates, groups involved in some house robberies. But the difficulty is to actually pin down the exact form of participation of these elements. But in any country, popular protests are always hijacked by criminal elements. I mean, you study the case in Burkina Faso, where they had a series of urban protests, service delivery protests around 2011. Even there, criminal elements from within society were also participating.
So it's a chance for the criminal to cash in as well.
Yes, you get shocked by the extent of violence that you actually see.
Let's talk about how this violence, the protest and the violence has escalated now and has become a big thing of police versus the protesters. Let's take us through that, Professor.
Well, the police, unfortunately, have to be there. And the police have to try and contain the violence that emanates from these protests. And the police sometimes, not all of them, sometimes some of them, you'll find that they are not well equipped and well trained to contain the violence emerging from these protests, rather in a more humane and more peaceful way. You see. Hence you find that now the police themselves end up now being implicated in violent suppression of protests by ordinary citizens.
Professor, where are the community leaders in this? Every ward and every municipality has a councillor that is accountable for their complaints and grievances. Who needs to be held accountable to try and avoid the scourge of these protests getting violent?
Look, one of the crises we have in South Africa, especially in the new dispensation, I'm sorry to say that, we have a crisis of authority. When I talk about a crisis of authority is where you find that even in our communities, the levels of disrespect for power and authority is actually growing, and it is becoming something which worries even those in power. Yes, in these communities there are community leaders, but the extent of control and influence and authority they have in their communities is one doubts it. one doubts their ability to give direction to popular discontent.
With that said, Professor, you've just conducted a study on service delivery protests. Compared to previous years, how violent and destructive have the recent protests been in South Africa?
Yes, let me correct you. I conducted study on service delivery protests in 2010.
All right.
Yeah, but not recently.
Not this year. All right.
Yes.
And what did you find in those findings? And let's compare that figure to now with what you've seen over the years.
Yes, it seems as though the service delivery protests recently, in terms of numbers, they are actually becoming more than we heard between 2008, 2009, and up to around August 2010. Yes, I can't compare the two when it comes to the levels of violence, because even the service delivery protests in the run-up to the 2009 election and immediately thereafter, they were actually violent. But there's no measure. It's very difficult to compare the cost of violence or the level of violence between the two phenomena.
Professor, let's talk about statistics that have been recently released indicate that South Africa has 5 protests daily. Do you think there'll ever be a solution for these protests to end in the near future? And what needs to be done?
It's a very difficult question. I say it's difficult because the more democracy deepens, the more it opens spaces for people to disagree with power. In other words, service delivery protests are also a part of democratic deepening. But on the other hand, service delivery protests that are so radical and uncontrolled and violent, they actually signify something, that spaces of lawlessness are beginning to emerge within our society. And then it has a negative connotation for the levels of authority and power that the government can exercise throughout our society. To say these protests can come to an end or be stopped is very difficult to predict, because so long as there is poverty, so long as there is growing hopelessness in some of these communities, we're still going to have these violent protests.
All right. Now, Professor, when the protest is over, who has to do the reconstruction of these damaged municipal buildings, the libraries and so forth? Because the very same people are going to go protesting for those very services that they actually destroyed.
Yes, government unfortunately has to intervene and deal with the aftermath of these protests and try to do some reconstruction. And unfortunately, I think we're running in circles. Yeah, something very big has actually to happen in South Africa so that we can turn on to a new page.
All right. And what can you say in general about the service delivery protest, Professor, especially in regards to this time of the year when everybody knows it's the beginning of a new year, and this year is also a very big year about elections?
Yes, we've had these incidents of service delivery protests in the run-up to the elections. That's why some analysts have actually said it's because communities are trying to draw government's attention to themselves, to say, before you set up a new policy agenda, please consider us as a top priority. Some analysts have said that's the message which is coming out of these service delivery protests, because we had them in 2003, 2004 before the elections.
Ongoing.
Yes, we've had them now from August 2008 and up to around August 2010, and we're having them now. So it looks like it's going to be a phenomenon which is part of our democracy, really, until government stops promising too big. Promise little and deliver big. I think that's what we need.
Wow, thank you so much. Of course, that was Professor Kwandiwe Kondlo, political analyst, talking while shedding some light to us about the recent rise of the service delivery protests that have unfortunately turned violent throughout South Africa. In other news now, at least 10